I think we are at the point where we can move on to our first panel. So Gabriel, I see Antonino is here and Jesse Kate is here. If they can be made panelists, so we can move to that. Let me see, is Gabriel on? Yes, he is on. I see him. Yes. Yes, he's here. He says, I'm here. So Ricky, if you can make Gabriel. And we will get moving. Okay, so as we move into, you got him? Yes, we've got him. Okay, Yushke. That's good. All right, so we're going to move to the first panel, which is the International Partners Policy and Space Law. I'm going to let each of our august panelists introduce themselves, and then we will have a few questions after they've gone through their introduction. And then I would like questions from the audience, because again, there's a lot of questions out there in terms of this very delicate issue with regards to space law and doing things legally rather than illegally, and what the problems are. Antonino bounded them nicely with the talk, and we want to delve a little deeper into that. So Jesse Kate, we'll start with you, go to Antonino, and then end with Gabriel, and then we'll dive into some questions that I have prepared and that you've had a look at, and we will then wait for the audience to chime in.
Sounds good. All right, can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can hear you.
Excellent. Thanks for having us. I work at the Open Lunar Foundation. We're a small international nonprofit, and we try to help cooperation on the moon by developing standards and institutions that help with governance and coordination. So in the case of space resources, this means looking at things like information sharing, understanding scarcity, the definition of safety zones, but we also do our best to work on projects that provide actual demonstrations of applied use cases. Right now we have some projects working on safety zones specifically, resource management, and bootstrapping of information sharing. So when we talk about a lunar resource campaign, what we want is that when this happens, that it can happen smoothly, peacefully, and cooperatively, but also that we have, like Carlos has been talking about and like Antonino talked about earlier, also that we have institutions and standards in place that make it easier to do these things in the first place. So I'll just stop there because I think we'll have a more interesting discussion and pass it on to the next person.
Okay, Antonino, over to you.
Thanks, Live, and thanks, Jesse. So I'm Antonino. I am a space lawyer specialized in lunar and space resources governance. I recently joined the Open Lunar Foundation, helping out with all the amazing things that Jesse Kate mentioned. I will just add one thing to what she already described that we would like to do and how we view the use of the moon and resources, which is like we also try to be international as much as possible and facilitate cooperation across different actors on the value chain, which is something that we believe is going to be critical, especially from the multi-stakeholder perspective, right? So far, space governance has always been focused on states, and they will remain the key entity, but we need other players to do much more. And so it's not just companies, obviously, that we already know that they will have an increasing role, but also civil society and making sure that all voices can be heard, not just for the sake of hearing them, but because that's the way we're going to get to better results in the future to solve very complex questions like the one we have in space resources and lunar governance. And I'll stop here to pass it to you back, Clive.
Okay, thank you. Over to you, Gabriel.
Thanks, everybody. And yes, hi, my name is Gabriel Swinney. I'm a senior policy advisor at NASA, and I work in the Office of Technology, Policy, and Strategy. And for those of you who don't know, this is a pretty new office established in the past year to sort of sit on top of the NASA leadership structure and look at issues that cross the entire agency. So this is long-term strategic and policy and technology planning. And one of the issues I was brought in to work on specifically was all the policy issues that arise with our lunar surface operations, and then moving onwards as part of our move to Mars. So this is near and dear to my heart. I am on detail from the Department of State, where I was the head of the space law portfolio for a number of years. And as part of that, I led our delegation to the legal subcommittee at COPUOS, which is, as many of you all will know, is deeply involved in space resources. I think I see two sort of modern phases in the space law conversation when we talk about space resources. One is from about 2015 to 2020. And I think the main conversation there was about whether or not it's even legally possible to engage in space resource utilization. This was really kicked off by the 2015 legislation, came out of the US Congress, giving US persons and companies legal ability to extract and own space resources. That caused a large debate within the international community. Some of you all may have tracked that at the time. And the question then was, can you do this at all? Is space resource utilization unlawful? Is it prohibited by the Outer Space Treaty? Between 2015 and 2020, I think there was a gradual progress in answering that question with a yes. And that really culminated, at least in my mind, with the negotiation and signing and public release of the Artemis Accords in October of 2020, which, among other things, includes a very clear statement that space resource utilization is not prohibited by the Outer Space Treaty. So I think that answered, at least for the US and our closest partners, and now the Artemis Accords are up to 21 signatories, that kind of answered that question. Is it legally possible? And I should say other countries have come to similar conclusions, not just traditional US allies, but I think governments such as China have also come to the same conclusion. So since 2020, and there were other things that happened in 2020 we can talk about, the US executive order about space resources, a NASA regolith purchase, which is a sort of a new thing. But since 2020, the conversation has really shifted to, if you're going to use space resources, what are the rules that govern that? And in my mind, that's really where the conversation needs to focus. There's a number of efforts about that, in COPUOS at the legal subcommittee. Also, there's GEGSLA, the Global Expert Group on Sustainable Lunar Activities, which is looking at many of these issues. And then, of course, individual countries, space agencies, and companies that might be engaged in space resource utilization also need to decide what rules or norms or best practices they will follow. So that's really how I see that conversation having shifted. And it's exciting now that we have some small-scale space resource utilization hopefully going to take place in the relatively near future. We have that difficult problem, right? It's a good problem to have, figuring out how do we do this now that we're actually going to do it. So I'll stop there, but happy to talk about any of that.
Okay. Yeah, it's a good problem to have, but we got to solve it, right? So I'm going to go through the list of questions I sent you, starting with the first one. From a legal viewpoint, what do you see as the biggest issue in being able to use lunar resources to sustain humans on the moon and establish a cislunar economy? And I'll let you just jump in.
I will take a stab at it. I'm curious what Jesse, Kate, and Antonino say. I think there's multiple issues. I sort of see two at the top of my mind. One has to do with more safety and deconfliction. How do we manage the fact or the possibility of having multiple actors operating in proximity, engaged in resource utilization that might cause some level of disruption or danger or interference to other actors? Now, this is an issue that's not unique to space resource utilization. There are, of course, other activities you can be engaged in space that have similar issues. But I do think space resources raise that question of deconfliction and avoiding interference in a particularly sort of, on point way because of some of the technologies involved that could cause possibilities of interference. So that's one. The other one that is really space resource utilization focus is how to deal with the possibility of scarcity. Jesse, Kate mentioned, the Open Lunar looks at questions of scarcity, and we don't really know. We don't know the characterization of, for example, lunar resources. But I do think that if we find that these resources are either concentrated in a relatively small number of places, or are scarcer than we are led to believe, then we're going to have to deal with that fact and how we avoid first movers from taking over and excluding others, and how we share the benefits and what benefit sharing looks like. That's really the sort of space resource specific problem that I have in mind.
Okay. Antonino, Jessica, go ahead, Jessica.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. It's very similar to what I wrote down as my headline here, which was site management is. So I guess that's more on the first one of the two that you mentioned, Gabriel. And I think, I mean, I'll just throw it there for discussion sake more than anything, but I might argue that that's more, what was the way you put it, Clive? Big, that's bigger as an issue at the moment, just because it's going to happen first. And so I think we won't know fully about scarcity until we get into sort of site management questions about access, not just to extraction itself, but also to the products of extraction, um, priority or exclusion, notification, et cetera. All of those are sort of being conjured at the moment. And that's before we know really anything about relative scarcity. So, for the sake of discussion and debate, I'd say site management, top priority.
Antonino.
I'll just complete because Gabriel and Jesse already said it all. Basically, what I wrote down as the main buzzword is priority rights, which I do think is going to be the biggest legal question. Thankfully, it's a question that we don't have to answer right now, in the sense that we are in early stages and we don't really need to solve it for operating, let's say, pioneering small-scale missions. But the real question will be how do we allocate priority rights to mine? At some point, there needs to be an answer to this question. Right now, the short answer would be each state allocates its own, and it does it by virtue of Article 1 of the Outer Space Treaty, which gives each state the freedom to use celestial bodies, and as part of that, you can use the resources. But is this sustainable in the long term, right? This is a more of a broader question. Do we need at some point to have at least minimum coordination mechanism like mutual recognition, and therefore a minimum harmonization of how do we allocate these priority rights? I think that will be the legal question to solve in time. Until we get there, the most important issue is deconfliction, as Gabriel said. How do we make sure that while we investigate the moon and get the data we need to see if we can actually do this, and if it is sustainable and economic, then how do we avoid stepping on each other's toes, and how do we avoid this becoming a big political incident or issue? Because that will jeopardize the whole exploration for everyone. So we need to make sure that over the next 10 years, we have mechanisms to reduce tension, to talk to each other, to make sure that we're not opening a big case, or that there is no scandal, as Carlos mentioned in his presentation. And then once we have solved that question and we gather the data, then the real question will come in and will be like, how do we actually allocate rights in an area that is not subject to any exclusive control by any state?
Okay.
I'd like to jump off of something Antonino mentioned about priority rights, because that's a really interesting one to me, because I can see the question of priority rights cutting in multiple ways, right? In one sense, priority rights could be you could see them as a bad thing, a way that early movers sort of gobble up space resources or get exclusive access to them in a way that sort of harms future generations or second movers or emerging countries. So priority rights could be a concern in that sense. On the other hand, and at the same time, priority rights can be a way to incentivize investment, right? If there were a system to develop that allowed sort of some level of certainty, some kind of certainty for those who are hoping to develop space resources, to have some level of guarantee that they will have access to those space resources and no one else would go and scoop them up, while they're on the way there or something. That could increase the possibility of investment and certainty for the entire community. So priority rights can be a tool. They can also be a danger. And figuring out how to do that is an issue I think I see, at least in the medium term. I agree with Antonino and Jesse Kate that that's not staring us in the face right this moment. But if we do want to incentivize resource development in the future, it is the kind of thing we're going to need to look at. And there's almost certainly lessons to be gained from terrestrial resource extraction that the space community needs to look at, because we are not used to having to deal with this problem.
Yeah, I think on that, actually, I would also just say that priority, um, not just for investment, but priority can be a really great thing depending on how you allocate them, like beyond investment, right? So, what goes along with having a system of priority rights is the accountabilities that would come along with that. And so, what those accountabilities are and how they're allocated in the first place uh, kind of matters to whether people experience them as being fair. And it's not that priority means um, priority will have implications for exclusion in different ways depending on the regime that's put in place. And so you think about like applying for geostationary slots. There are conditions that go along with those applications. It's not just first come, first served by default. And so there's just a huge design space in there for us to think about. And I fear sometimes that when we assume that it's going to be the worst version of priority rights, we don't actually get into the design space and trade-offs that could really advance the ecosystem.
Yeah, exactly. It's just I'll just add one thing, which is a matter of finding a balanced solution that doesn't feel like a prevarication. Because there are two sides of this question, right? There is the side of those who are investing billions of dollars in space mining and they need to be protected. And there is the side of everyone else, which is not investing money, but still is concerned with what we do with the moon and resources. And that interest also has to be taken into account. And so hopefully we'll find a middle ground. And I agree that priority rights, like every legal tool, they're a neutral tool. Depends what do we make of them. But in fact, that's why we need to have this conversation now that we don't have the pressure of having anyone exercising these priority rights. That's really why we are living, and I think, in a golden age of space law and policy, because we do have the time and the luxury to just really delve into the details. But in 10 years, we won't have that. So that's why this time is really critical.
Question just came in, and Dean, I haven't forgotten yours. We'll get to that as we go through this. From Don Barker, who will hold anyone accountable for behaving properly regarding any resources of Earth? And that actually, I'm going to segue into the my next question that was on the bulleted list because of that. Because in listening to your conversation here, it's the legal side and policy side is having the same issue as the commercial side. We don't have the data to be able to build a credible business model. Do we have enough data to build a credible legal framework? And that leads into my question: how should a legal framework for lunar resource utilization be established? And would data from a resource evaluation campaign that was done internationally, would that be enabling for that to happen?
I can riff a bit on that and start passing it around. Actually, I wanted to start with the accountability question. I think that obviously there's many mechanisms for accountability in the international community. Treaties would be the most familiar one, and I think most people are of the opinion that we're not exactly in a moment of treaty making at this particular point in international history and law. And so most folks in the community are looking at other mechanisms to draw on, whether it's building off of existing treaties or doing something that's more kind of bottom up. The accords are one approach to that. More broadly, I think looking at sort of voluntary mechanisms that involve kind of not trade-offs, but that involve sort of carrots that incentivize people to participate in coordination mechanisms or frameworks look like they're going to be an important tool for us to be leveraging. And so I think that's a really exciting area of research for us to look into further. And there's many examples that we can talk about. In terms of the legal framework itself, I mean, I guess it's a very similar set of comments. I think that you could say, well, ideally, we'd all get together, we'd stop everything else we're doing, all the countries and all the lunar actors, and we'd, sit around a table in a circle and we'd come up with a pure consensus agreement to how we're going to do everything, right? And then there's the opposite end of the spectrum, which is very much an organic kind of emergent approach. And presumably we're going to end up with somewhere in the middle. And one of the questions is how do we kind of provoke and demonstrate and scaffold into a set of agreements that will both use demonstration and kind of lived experience to inform effective governance approaches that that sort of respond to those experiences. And so I think it's going to end up being a very dialectic approach to whatever legal regimes we end up in. And it's, in some sense, there's an opportunity there, and it's up to us in the community to decide which activities we want to put forward as the exemplars that motivate that.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think, we will, in the short term at least, be responding to the actual sort of operational problems that we have. So we're going to be, for example, back to what we said originally, like these questions of sort of deconfliction, those are likely to happen earlier because they happen whether you're successful in your space resource utilization or not. Those may happen earlier than questions of, for example, benefit sharing. So I do think in the immediate term, the space community is probably going to sort of be solving the problems as they arise on a need to solve basis. That doesn't mean that the solutions we come up with are sort of permanent or the final answer. This is very much going to be a learning process, as Jesse Kate said. Just as, and this is for those of you who've heard me talk before, this is going to sound familiar, but just as the technology and science is experimental, is learning, so is the law and policy, right? Humanity has never done this before, created a wholly new regime for a wholly new place, sort of beyond any nation's borders. There are some examples, Antarctic and the high seas, but they're not perfect parallels. So we are going to have to be comfortable with adjusting over time and having temporary answers for the questions that we have to have answers for in the meantime, and then evaluating and shifting. So that's a little bit of an unusual place for both governments and private sector, both of whom, for different reasons, really like predictability and final answers. But we are going to have to take a little bit more of an engineering or exploration mindset, I think, to the law and policy world in a way that we haven't necessarily before.
Yeah, and I also like to add one thing, which is we do have a framework right now, right? We do have a legal framework that is governing space activities, and that will apply to space resources as well. The question is really like, how do we devise more specific rules that can respond better to the needs of space resources? And let's also not forget that space resource activities have already been done for scientific purposes, starting from the Apollo mission to Hayabusa. We do already have done this. We have regulated it. It happened under the Outer Space Treaty. Everything is fine. The question is, we want to do something on a larger scale, and we need to expand and interpret these rules also for commercial involvement, which is a partially different question than setting up a regime from scratch. So we just want to specify the regime we do have already in a better way, and that makes our job easier. And in a way, this also answers the question of accountability. Right now, we do have Article 6 of the Outer Space Treaty, which tells you if something goes wrong, there is a state that will always be responsible, and Article 7 will tell you that another state will always be liable. And that's not going to change for space resources, and it's already there. And that's the reason why all states have been so careful in licensing and authorizing and supervising these activities, because if this company screw up, then it's going to be your State Department to be responsible for it. And then, Clive, to your point, is it going to be useful to have an international resources evaluation campaign? I would say absolutely yes, because we want to make rules. If we're going to implement the rules we do already have now, we need more information on how to do that. As Gabriel and Jesse already mentioned, this is a learning process. It's an iterative process. And so we need more information from the scientists and the actual understanding of the environment to know what's going to be the best way also to regulate and govern. So more than the substance of the rules, also the processes matter, and whether or not we want to have a process for this in a specific way. And the final thing that I want to mention is that it's going to be a multi-level effort at this stage, right? At this point in time, we do have the Outer Space Treaty. What we need to go at the international level is a shared minimum set of understandings on how do we interpret the Outer Space Treaty. That is what the Artemis Accords are trying to do, right? How do we interpret the freedom of use celestial bodies in justifying space resource activities? And that's what we need at the international level. And then national law and policy and licensing will play with the details, will evolve the regulation. And then once we are satisfied with what we have in national legislation, we can go back and create a treaty maybe in 20 years or 15 years. But at the same time, it's important to have this balance, right? We cannot just purely delegate everything to national law, because that will create tensions and misunderstandings. But we do need to leverage national law in a way that is like going through certain boundaries set up at the multilateral level. And that's what the working group on space resources is trying to do. So I think we are on track actually for both processes in a good way.
Okay.
What can I follow on to that just briefly to point out that I think the cool thing about a resource campaign that we're talking about here is that it's international to start. And so we can go in kind of eyes wide open to the coordination questions with a group of people that we already know we want to coordinate with and have sort of good coordination mechanisms between. And then to do what I was saying earlier, which is to choose the sort of exemplars that we put forward to sort of like provoke in a positive way responses and contemplations around the policy questions. And Gabriel and I have talked a lot about this, but we talk about the idea of riffing on technology demonstrations. We can also have policy demonstrations, and that's something that we are thinking about a lot at Open Lunar. It's something that this community could think about, and I'd be really keen to see kind of where we take it, especially on the direction of information sharing as part of the Artemis Accords. Maybe that's a question for you, Gabriel, is where the partners of the Accords are getting at when they talk about kind of policies around information sharing, and if there's something to like iterate on there or to take into the demonstration realm.
I want to ask Carlos's question in the chat here. Would priority rights be for exploration and extraction, or only for extraction? He says, I would like to emphasize the need for some sort of security to investors.
I would say they have to be for both. If you get, like, this is what's happening also in other fields, you get a permit to explore, and then you get sort of priority over what you explore. Then there are ways to like secure this in different manners. Like, for instance, under the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, you don't really get to keep the entire site that you explore, but you need to share it with the International Seabed Authority. I'm not saying that should be a model. I'm saying there are different ways to do that. But I would say if the purpose is making sure and giving confidence to investors, then you need a way to connect prospecting and actual extraction, because otherwise there will be less incentive for prospecting if all the data that you get and all the areas that you scout can be stolen from you essentially by those who will just wait for you to do all the job, and then they will just jump in and say, oh, we want this area, because we know now that there is already a lot of resources.
Yeah, this is a tough one because the Outer Space Treaty requires freedom of access to all areas of celestial bodies and freedom of scientific and other investigations. So it's hard to imagine a way that you could prevent someone else from doing their own investigation, unless you mutually agreed. You could obviously always have mutual agreement among countries or the industry or the space community to have some kind of system like this. But the problem you're gonna have is dealing with outside actors who aren't part of your system. In that case, priority rights get really difficult, whether you're talking about exploration or exploitation. So I do think there are tools we can develop. I think they're important, but we do have to keep in mind that unless we end up in a perfect world, there's going to be people or countries that have their own views and that don't necessarily participate in this. And we need to build in ways to deal with that fact. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing anything wrong. It just means that they have a different perspective on what they want to do. So that's where I myself haven't kind of worked through in my own mind, like how priority rights for either of those things, exploration or exploitation, would work in a system like that. I will say this makes me think, I want to go ahead and mention it since it's relevant here. It also makes me think about how the way we think about information may need to shift over time. The tradition, I'm at NASA now, and the tradition that's actually baked into the laws about NASA is that all the scientific information we gather is made 100% publicly available. And I think there's no chance that would change. I don't think there's any appetite to change, the public information sharing of U.S. civil government activities. But that is not the perspective of, let's say, an exploration company, right? If you're an exploration company, that data is your product. That's what you can make money from by selling it then to exploitation companies. So we are going to need to adjust our expectations, I think, once more purely commercial actors start engaging in these space resource activities. We're going to need to adjust our expectations for what becomes public. And we need to really thoughtfully think through what kind of information does the entire community need, right? So clearly safety information. You need information able to operate safely. That's one side of that's the easy answer. On the far side, there's some amount of information that's like highly proprietary and is in fact the product. And figuring out where that line is and what you share and who you share it with is going to be, I think, one of the many frontiers that we're going to have to develop rules about.
Can I make a comment on that? Because I think it's interesting, tie back to Antonino's talk, or our talk that Antonino gave about thinking about information licensing. And in the same way that we often try to emphasize that property rights are not necessarily private property rights. I think in the information space we can kind of nuance when we talk about information sharing. It doesn't just mean kind of open, unlicensed, anybody can do anything with it information sharing. You can have open access information that might have a licensing requirement around its use. And I don't know if that's the right way to go about it. But for example, you could say anybody can access this, but if you plan a mission around it, then you need to, share something back to the people who gave the information to you. So there's a big design space there, and I think it's worth kind of getting into. And I'm really curious what some of the companies and government entities are thinking about in that space.
Okay. All right. I've got 3 questions left on my list, and I still want to get to Dean's. I think there was a question in there. Dean, can you recast your comment to a question, please? I'm gonna just skip the Artemis Accords one because I think that I'm gonna talk about the elephants in the room. You think the United States would be able to collaborate with China and Russia in a coordinated international lunar resource evaluation campaign? Are there avenues open for that?
I can start with that, even though, and probably exactly because I don't work for either government. That's why I think we need a neutral entity, right? That's exactly the reason why if you set up something that has to be truly international, you need a mediator among countries that are not part of the same club. And that will also allow each of these groups to focus on their own activity because someone else is taking care of coordinating their own group with the other groups. I do think that's really one of the possible solutions. And one that for the coordinated campaign can work very well, especially because if you look at China, for instance, and Gabriel can correct me if I'm wrong, what the Wolf Amendment, which is the legal barrier that you have in the United States, prohibits is direct bilateral cooperation between the two countries. But as long as there is a third person in the room or a mediator, then this changes completely. And so that could already help solving the problem. For Russia, it's a bit more of a political issue in the sense that they're also cutting themselves out of any cooperation. So I don't even think a neutral mediator could really work. The only place that they're still talking to other countries is the UN, and let's see how it's going to go next year. But I do see that a non-governmental entity stepping in can facilitate reducing politicization and focusing on, the concrete work that you want to do together.
Yeah,
Okay.
no, that's definitely right. I mean, it's certainly possible, and it's not unprecedented for the United States to coordinate or at least discuss, space activities with China, let's say, in multilateral fora. That is certainly the easiest way to do it under the Wolf Amendment. I will say the Wolf Amendment is not a 100% prohibition. There are certifications the administrator of NASA can make, transmit them to Congress, and there are ways to then coordinate more directly on a bilateral basis. Historically, we've done that for mission safety reasons, typically. But if there was a strong political desire and no risk of intellectual property transfer, then it is possible. I will say, in some ways, the cynical part of me says that one-way coordination is already happening as a default because NASA and the United States are so transparent about our activities. We tell everyone what we intend to do, where we're going to go, and then we dump all the scientific data out into the public. So all of our information is very much out there. And if the Chinese Space Agency wants to download it, they can. It's on the internet. And they themselves also make certain amounts of information public. Some of the Chang'e landing sites, for example, or potential landing sites were made public. So that's not direct coordination. It's kind of like signaling back and forth that does allow for some level of shaping of steps. But there's the major sticking point. I think it's not just the Wolf Amendment. It's that other actors don't tend to be as open with what they do as we traditionally are. So it's really difficult to coordinate after the fact. And if you're operating with another actor who only tells you of their successes, who only publishes data after it's been through a political scrubbing process, that makes it really difficult to coordinate. Even if you sort of jump through the legal hoops, you then have like a real technical problem with coordination because you can't trust your data. So I'm actually more hopeful about the possibility of coordination than I think a lot of people, because I don't think the Wolf Amendment is a big no. I think, as Antonino said, there's lots of ways to coordinate. And I should say there are other bodies we should look at internationally. There's the UN COPUOS, but there's also sort of associated bodies like Same Page, the Space Mission Planning Advisory Group, that does near Earth object coordination. And there's some other bodies as well. So there are ways to do it, but you have to have real partners on both sides.
Okay, we're running out of time, and this is from Dean. Polar volatiles are not the only source of needed volatiles on the lunar surface. Why are we not including the pyroclastic and high titanium resources within our assessment? Those latter resources are known to be far greater than polar volatiles. Now, in the policy side, a resource is a resource, if I'm not mistaken. So in this discussion, these would be included. Is that correct?
In my mind, yes. I will say that, so space resources are space resources. Agree with that. They do raise different policy issues, though, based on where they are and how you collect them, just because sort of the technical details. This is something I've been trying to learn more about. And I think it's true that, for example, a lot of European and Australian interest right now is not about frozen volatiles. It's much more about regolith processing. So yes, that's like titanium and oxygen. And other things that I don't understand as well. Those raise different issues because they're not concentrated, presumably in the same way. I mean, they're not uniformly distributed, but they're not concentrated just on like the bottom of permanently shadowed craters, for example. So that might make things a little easier. On the other hand, my understanding is that that kind of resource extraction requires substantial energy to use and creates large tailing piles, basically, like leftovers. So that raises other issues that water extraction may not raise, that uses less energy and doesn't really create as much waste. So it's not that it's not covered, it's just that like the technical details lead to separate policy and therefore legal concerns.
And maybe I'll just jump off that and say that I think from a management and policy standpoint, one of the things that will be important for us to think about as we get into the actual management of these resources is that different features will lead to very different management regimes. As Gabriel's pointing out, if you have sort of very distributed versus very concentrated resources, or you think about like spectrum management, spectrum is a natural resource that's going to be managed in a very different way than like water, ice, and a PSR. And so we need to get more specific when we think about resources. A piece of work that we did, a couple different pieces of work we did last year. One was we had a fellow named Zach Wagner who developed what he called a scorecard for looking at the scarcity of different resources. And it was sort of like a proof of concept, but the idea was to look at not just the kind of resource, but also the ways in which we're thinking about using them. And these things together come, like you need to consider both of them in order to think about when scarcity is likely to present itself. And the other thing we did is a study on the different kinds of resource systems that we're seeing emerge on the moon and different potential management regimes. So I'll put a link to that study in the chat. But I think it's just, again, it's interesting to, like, when you get into more details on these things, you realize that indeed we will need very different management approaches to all of them.
Okay. All right. Well, I want to thank our panelists. We are at the end of our time here. Thank you very much, and thank you for the link. I see that in there, Jesse Kate. Appreciate that. Found this to be very interesting. As I say, geologist, so out of my depth here, but I'm sure I could get myself in trouble by talking about policy. So this is why it's good. I'm glad you were able to join us today, and thank you for your insights. And this is going to be recorded. I've taken notes, and these will go into our recommendations that we'll talk about when we get to, and our findings when we get to do the wrap up after the next panel.